ISAF has confirmed that a helicopter crashed in Wardak, but refused to comment on casualties. A spokesman said an investigation team are at the scene. The military rarely comments on operations involving special forces.
Chinese state media have sharply criticized the United States after the American credit rating was, for the first time ever, downgraded from the top AAA level by the Standard & Poor's agency. The Xinhua news agency said the days were over when the US could borrow its way out of messes of its own making. It also suggested there should be a new global reserve currency to replace the dollar. China is America's largest creditor. From Beijing, Michael Bristow.
Xinhua has released a withering attack on what it sees as US financial mismanagement. The United States, it says, has to return to common sense and live within its means. Beijing believes it has a legitimate right to criticize Washington. China is America's sole biggest creditor. It's bought at least $1 trillion of US debt. It worries that it won't get that money back, or that the uncertainties surrounding the dollar could hit the Chinese economy.
Standard & Poor's said it had cut the US credit rating to AA+ because the recent debt reduction plan didn't go far enough. But the US has accused it of making a $2 trillion error in its calculations. Marcus George is in Washington.
It was the week when America's troubled finances were laid bare. It started with a last-minute deal to prevent the country running out of money. It ended in the downgrade of the gold-plated credit rating for the first time ever. Standard & Poor's informed the administration of the imminent downgrade. The White House launched rearguard action, saying the agency had miscalculated its figures. Just hours later, S&P went public. Its message, America's debt reduction plan, had fallen short.
The Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan has used the 66th anniversary of the dropping of the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima to repeat his pledge to make the country less reliant on nuclear energy. Mr. Kan first called for a review of Japan's energy policy after the earthquake and tsunami in March, which destroyed a nuclear power station at Fukushima. World news from the BBC. The militant Islamist group in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, says it has abandoned its bases in the capital, Mogadishu. Eyewitnesses told the BBC they saw convoys of militants leaving the city in the middle of the night. Richard Hamilton reports.
Pro-government African Union troops have been fighting the Al-Shabaab rebels in Mogadishu in recent days in order to secure the supply of food aid to those suffering from the drought in Somalia. The extent of the withdrawal is not yet clear. The government spokesman hailed it as, in his words, a golden victory for the Somali people. But Al-Shabaab, which still controls much of the south of the country, described the move as a tactical withdrawal, promising a counterattack. Analysts say the Islamist rebels have moved their forces around the city in the past. Nevertheless, this appears to be a significant gain for the government.
The Saudi media are reporting that a gunman has been shot dead in Jeddah as he opened fire at the palace of the Interior Minister, Prince Nayef bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. The state news agency says the man fired at a checkpoint near the palace at 1 a.m. local time and was swiftly dealt with. It says there were no other casualties or deaths. Prince Nayef is second in line to the Saudi throne. He has long been one of the most powerful forces in the country. Flights have been cancelled at the airport in the Yemeni capital Sana'a after clashes broke out on Friday evening between government forces and tribal fighters. Many residents in the Hasaba neighbourhood of Sana'a fled the fight, which appears to have ended now. It involved publican guards and tribes aligned with the opposition. Back in May, similar clashes threatened a descent into all-out war. More than 200,000 people have been evacuated from coastal regions of eastern China, which are being threatened by a powerful typhoon. Thousands of ships have also been called back to shore, and transport networks have been suspended as Typhoon Weifang menaces the coast of Zhejiang province. The storm is expected to hit the coast on Sunday. BBC News.
You're listening to World Briefing from the BBC with David Brown. The next half hour we will hear from our Beijing correspondent about how China has lambasted the US economic management in the wake of Washington's credit rating downgrade. First we start in Afghanistan, where a US helicopter has crashed during an overnight operation, killing 31 US Special Forces personnel and 7 Afghan nationals. The Taliban say they shot the plane down. It's one of the worst losses in a single day for coalition troops since the war began.
operation taking place in Wardak, just to the west of where I am in Kabul. The insurgents, the Taliban, were engaged in. After that, two Chinook helicopters, they are the large workhorse helicopters which transport troops all around this country. One of those helicopters crashed for reasons unknown. The Taliban say they brought it down, but we haven't had any confirmation of that. 31 US Special Forces, as you said, were on board that helicopter, along with 7 Afghan soldiers. This is the blackest day yet for the international mission here in Afghanistan. There'll never be such a heavy loss of life in a single day, in a single incident. It's nearly 10-year war.
Now, what's the evidence, one way or the other, whether the Taliban were responsible for shooting the helicopter down?
We haven't had any confirmation from the international mission here in Afghanistan, ISAF, on casualty figures, or indeed as to what happened to this helicopter. All we've seen is that a helicopter crashed, and they have investigators at the scene trying to establish what took place. They say though that they very rarely comment on special forces operations whenever they take place in Afghanistan. And it seems that this was a special forces operation.
And because it's such a large number involved, indeed the largest number of forces killed in one incident since the conflict began in 2001, what sort of impact is this likely to have on the US and on NATO?
Overall, it will not have any kind of catastrophic impact, but it will of course affect morale, because this is it's such a large order from the last incident. I think the last incident was back in 2005, where 16 special forces soldiers were killed when that one was brought down by the insurgents. But this one is of course of an entirely different magnitude.
Quentin, thanks very much for that update. That's Quentin Somerville speaking to me live from the Afghan capital, Kabul. The proverb, "May you live in interesting times," is generally thought to have originated in ancient China, but is meant as a curse, and in that sense the United States is indeed experiencing interesting times. For the first time in its history, its top-notch status as a reliable payer of debts, in modern parlance its AAA rating, has been breached, and China, the emerging economic power of the 21st century, has wasted no time in expressing its view on the matter. Its official news agency said the United States government has to come to terms with the painful fact that good old days when it could just burrow its way out of messes of its own making are finally gone. But the Chinese go on to call something unprecedented in modern times, a new, stable global reserve currency other than the mighty US dollar. Well, I asked our correspondent in Beijing, Michael Bristow, exactly what the Chinese were saying.
This is a very withering attack on the United States and what China believes is its financial mismanagement. They say the days when the United States can borrow from overseas to cover up its financial problems at home have gone. It goes on further to say there should perhaps be a new global reserve currency to replace the dollar, although it knows that's slightly unrealistic. There is really, particularly at this time with the euro's troubles, nothing really to replace the dollar. It's quite a withering attack, as I said, strident, undiplomatic language, but it really just echoes what the Chinese government have been saying for some time, that essentially the US government borrows too much money, it isn't doing enough to put the policies in place to pay that back, and it worries about what that might mean for the money that China has lent to the United States and the wider world economy.
I was going to say, in the one sense, this is a wide attack on the United States and its debt levels, but of course there is some Chinese self-interest in mind, as well as the largest foreign holder of its government debt.
Exactly, that shouldn't be underestimated. China is America's biggest foreign creditor. It has at least $1 trillion worth of US debt, so it's got a direct interest in what goes on in America. If America can't pay back its debts, then that would obviously have an impact on China. Also, the debt crisis in America could have an effect on the economy there. It could mean consumers buying less Chinese goods. That could also affect the Chinese economy. So certain people in Beijing are looking at what's going on in America, and they're very concerned about it. I've also got to say, though, the Chinese are taking a little swipe here, and perhaps they're hitting back because of all the criticism they've faced over the years about their own currency being undervalued primarily from the United States.
That was Michael Bristow. Well, it was yesterday evening, soon after Wall Street had closed for the weekend, that the Americans first heard the news that Standard & Poor's had downgraded the US credit rating from its top AAA value by one level to AA+. The US government has huge debts, and it's clear the credit agencies now feel that not enough has been done to deal with it. This is how some Americans in New York's Times Square reacted to the news of the downgrade.
I don't think we're a bad investment. I think we've got some very, very bad leadership and bad interest groups that are affecting things very negatively. It started probably 12 years ago. It's continued on. They start with Clinton. Bush really didn't address it, and now Barack Obama's made it that much worse.
Haven't gotten any good news lately. You know, everything's costing more. Jobs are hard hit.
Well, reaction from the Republican camp has been equally downbeat. Presidential hopeful Newt Gingrich, campaigning in Iowa, had this assessment.
I think this is a very sober warning. We're still the wealthiest country in the world. We still have the most natural resources of any country. We have the most energy of any country. But the fact that this downgrade has occurred should be very sober and should remind us that there's much, much more to be done than has been done in the last few weeks.
Well, our business correspondent Joe Lynham has been telling me more about what the downgrade means.
The downgrade basically means that America will have to pay a slightly higher rate of interest when it goes to get money on the open markets. And when you have the economy the size of the United States, which is still by a mile the largest in the world, that adds up. Some estimates, the initial estimates put it around $75 billion in extra interest payments would have to be paid by the Americans. Now, the reality is that trickles down through the rest of the economy. It starts off with the big banks and then goes to the small commercial banks, and it ends up in you and I paying that little bit more for our home loans, our student loans, and our car loans. And so the impact from a consumer's point of view is going to be noticeable. It is going to be seriously noticeable.
So what about other major economies? Are they likely to see their own credit ratings downgraded? Here's Joe Lynham again.
I reckon that the downgrade is going to mean that those countries that are on AAA rating, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, etc., that they will come under the microscope a little bit more, that the agencies, Fitch, Moody's and S&P, will kick the tires quite a bit harder for those economies, especially those economies with large debt problems, and possibly look at downgrading them. And that means that they too will have to pay that little bit more on the open markets for their money, and they won't be able to get their debt down easier if they have to pay that bit more for the open money. So it could have a very nasty concentric circle effect around the world, not just in the United States, but in the in the Western world as we know it, which most countries of which are heavily in debt.
Joe Lynham. And those European leaders have been discussing their own debt crisis. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel said after speaking to leaders from Britain, Italy and France that Eurozone countries needed to move much faster to implement agreements made at a summit 2 weeks ago. Steve Evans reports from Berlin.
Chancellor Merkel, on holiday in the Alps, talked to Messrs Cameron, Sarkozy and Berlusconi at their various retreats in Italy and France. One of the problems she addressed was that the markets have now realised that deals that seem to be done at the summit in Luxembourg on July the 21st have not yet been agreed by national parliaments in Eurozone countries, including her own. After the conversations on Friday night, her statement said, decisions made by the summit should be implemented quickly. But there is a problem. Firstly, parliaments across the Eurozone will not resume until at least September, and secondly, there may well be debate and delay when they do. It may underline the difficulty of having a single currency zone without a central decision-making body.